Kowtowing in the West, yet pointing fingers in the East. From May the 1st to May the 5th, the Japanese Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi embarked on a tour of Vietnam and Australia. In the Vietnamese capital Hanoi, she rebranded Japan's free and open Indo-Pacific policy, first rolled out by Shinzo Abe a decade ago, as a vision of freedom and openness. But read between the lines, and the message is clear. China is the problem, Japan is the solution, and everyone else is expected to agree. In Canberra, the language grew even more theatrical. Economic coercion, market disruptions, shared ambition for a peaceful, stable and prosperous region. Big words, intentionally vague, convenient too when you need a fabricated thread to advance your own selfish agenda. Some might call it strategic ambiguity. Others would call it blaming others for reactions to your own moves. Then came the optics. In Canberra, Takaichi knelt at the tomb of the unknown soldier, commemorating fallen Australian soldiers over the past century, including 39,000 who fought against Imperial Japan. Respectful? Perhaps. Selective? Definitely. Because across much of Asia, where Japan left much deeper scars, such as in China, where over 35 million people were killed or wounded at the hands of Japanese imperial aggressors, such gestures remain notably absent. Is it genuine diplomacy, or is it a well-dressed troublemaker at work? Welcome to this special edition of The Point with me, Liu Xin, an opinion show coming to you live from Beijing. I'm pleased to be joined from Alberta, Canada by Jiang Wenran, founding director of the China Institute at the University of Alberta and an advisor at the Institute of Peace and Diplomacy, a non-profit think tank in Canada and the US. From Maryland, the United States, by Sourabh Gupta, Senior Asia-Pacific International Relations Policy Specialist at the Institute for China-America Studies. And from Brisbane, Australia, by Warwick Powell, Adjunct Professor at Queensland University of Technology. The warmest welcome to all of you gentlemen. Let's first have a very brief recap of Takaichi's visits to Vietnam and Australia from May the 1st to May the 5th. In Vietnam, Takaichi held meetings with General Secretary of the Communist Party of Vietnam and President To Lam and Prime Minister Le Minh Hoang. They discussed strengthening the Japan-Vietnam comprehensive strategic partnership, including in economic security fields such as energy and critical minerals. In addition, during the visit, Takaichi delivered a speech on Japan's foreign policy, including the evolution of a so-called free and open Indo-Pacific, or FOIP. In Australia, the two countries signed 4 new documents to bolster cooperation on energy, defence and critical minerals, while warning against economic coercion and promising to consider a joint response if their economic security is threatened. During the visit, as I said, Takaichi also visited the Australian War Memorial and knelt at the tomb of the unknown soldier. So let's start with the last piece of the picture, which is the visit to the memorial of the unknown soldier. And this really caught the attention of the Chinese general public here once the story broke. And naturally, a lot of people started to associate this scene with another scene back in December 1917, when then German Chancellor Willy Brandt fell to his knees at the memorial to the Warsaw Ghetto, and this was known as the Warsaw Genuflection, which kind of opened the door to Germany's reintegration into the international community. And I want to start with Professor Jiang Wenran there. What went through your mind when you saw that picture of Takaichi kneeling in front of the Australian memorial? Is she trying to imitate what German Chancellor Brandt was trying to do?
Well, the meaning is unmistakable. The image is clear. We're in the multimedia age, and projecting certain images is everything. So here, Takaichi, popular at home, and trying to shake off Japan's war past by being actually just offering to the Yasukuni shrine, which actually honors militarism. And then she does this gesture, which wants to tell the world that Japan has changed. Japan is different. The newer generation of Japan cannot be associated with the past Japan. How that will be received. So my question would be, would she do the same in the Nanjing Memorial of the Japanese massacres there to do exactly the reflection? We're yet to see, but the optics is very clear on what she tries to achieve and tries to tell the world.
Mr. Supta, let me turn to you. Just now, Professor Jiang talked about the Yasukuni Shrine. We all know that it is a very controversial site where Japanese war dead are nominally honored, but among them are 14 Class A war criminals, people who were charged and convicted because they launched the war against so many people and left a trail of destruction, really barbarism in the gravest terms. So 2 weeks before Takaichi knelt at the Australian Memorial, she actually paid ritual offerings, so she contributed, and in her name, in her official capacity, to that Yasukuni shrine. And of course, that drew very strong representation and opposition from countries which have suffered at the hands of Japanese imperialism. So how do you look at this? It feels like, if we again take the example of the German chancellor, it's like he was kneeling in front of the monuments to the Jews, but then 2 weeks earlier, he was just paying tribute to the Nazis.
I think you brought up an excellent point out here. You know what? We have to remember that the 14 Class A war criminals were enshrined in, I think it was sometime in the mid 1970s, and ever since the date when they were enshrined, the emperor has not gone back to Yasukuni. And you would hope that if the emperor has not gone back to Yasukuni, cabinet members, including a sitting prime minister, would not be making their offerings and certainly not be visiting the shrine. And of course, we know as cabinet minister, Ms. Takaichi has gone to Yasukuni. I think having gone to the tomb of the unknown soldier in Canberra, maybe next time around she should go to the tomb of the unknown soldier, which is not very far actually from Yasukuni, called Chidorigafuchi, very close by. I hope she will go there next time. And therefore, the two things that stood out in my mind, nothing to do with Willy Brandt, frankly, two things that stood out. This is the disciple of Shinzo Abe. Shinzo Abe in 2015 had made a kind of a he had to make a statement on what was the 70th anniversary. And he was being seen very closely by Westerners as to what he would say, as well as by Asians. So, this is about kissing up to the white people. So he went and said the things that he should have said, which the American audiences would hear clearly. And he said those things, but the regrets and the apologies to the Asian people were not said in his words. He borrowed the words of previous prime ministers and just repeated those. He didn't even repeat those words. He said, these were the words said by our previous prime minister. I embrace those. So he did not have that apology to the Asian, who suffered at his hands. And this is so much of Japan, which is unchanged for 150 years. Kiss up to white people and kick down Asian people. That's why the reason it did not succeed, because it did not rise up with Asia a century ago. And we are seeing really not much has changed in many respects in what we have today in Japan, especially in the ultra-conservative establishment of which Ms. Takaichi is a representative.
Mr. Powell, observing all of this from Australia, what have you seen?
Well, in terms of the kneeling at the War Memorial in Canberra, it is something that I'm sure will be reasonably well received in Australia. After all, the Japanese Imperial Army bombed Darwin and also attacked an Australian naval vessel with mini submarines in Sydney Harbour, ultimately sinking a vessel and killing 21 sailors. On top of that, the Japanese Imperial Army exacted torture on Australian prisoners of war. So in terms of the display at the War Memorial in Canberra, I'm sure that that will be well received domestically, but there is a wider picture here. As other guests have mentioned, the situation concerning Japanese war atrocities are not constrained to what Japan did to Australia. Far from it. In fact, in the scheme of things, Japanese attacks on Australia are relatively minor. Japan these days presents four faces. Firstly, it presents a loyal and obedient servant face to the Americans. This is the idea of its ingratiation to Anglo-Saxons that it has engaged in for well over a century. Domestically, it presents the face of being nationalist and warrior-oriented. It also runs around the region from time to time seeking to present itself as an advocate and promoter of regional peace, but always on a selective basis. And fourthly, when it suits, it presents itself as a contrite apologist for the war crimes that it committed. Now, we know this very clearly as a result of this most recent trip, because when the Prime Minister Takaichi arrived in Vietnam, there was no acknowledgement, in fact, of the war crimes committed by the Japanese Imperial Army in relation to Vietnam. The most devastating atrocity during the course of 1944-45 was actually a man-made famine that killed up to 2 million Vietnamese people as a result of forced crop substitution, stockpiling and looting, and of course the blocking of relief by the Japanese Imperial Army. No apologies were made to the Vietnamese. We also saw, of course, during the course of the Second World War, Japanese war crimes and atrocities to the point of destroying villages, extensive sexual violence, and ultimately a refusal to atone for its atrocities across Asia. This, unfortunately, just confirms these four faces of Japan, and unfortunately, it will mean that instead of playing a constructive role in building and sustaining regional peace, it is repeating its historic role as being a bringer of instability and warfare to the region.
Four faces, Warwick mentioned there. I want to get the opinion from Mr. Jiang Wenran, Professor Jiang. What do you think? Do you think there are these multiple faces that Japan is presenting depending on the kind of audience it envisages for itself? And if so, what explains the stark difference in its attitude when it was in Vietnam? You know, not talking about the war crime, not talking about the atrocity, certainly not kneeling, but kneeling in Australia. And according to records, we can find this seems to be the very first time an incumbent Japanese political leader or prime minister has ever done this in terms of its war past.
Well, I think I agree with Professor Powell's assessment, which he gave much detail about this double standard and the mentality that Japan somehow lost the war to the Americans and its allies, not the Asian people, not to the Chinese. That's actually a major theme of the Yasukuni Shrine, which, as a researcher, I've done over the decades, much of the research of the shrine for the research purpose. The theme was clear. So therefore, it's not surprising to me that the emphasis for Takaichi's visit to Vietnam is to overlooking all of this and trying to emphasize the current threat or the coercion or the territorial disputes that Japan and Vietnam shared with China. So that theme is very clear in Hanoi's visit. Remember this, the timing is also very important other than the delivery of the kneeling down image. She is there telling the Vietnamese that you have territorial disputes with China on the South China Sea. Japan has territorial disputes with the East China Sea. We share something together and we should do something together in that regard. And therefore, this idea of free and open Indo-Pacific raised up by her predecessor is being revived to be probably less of an ideological flavor, because somehow Trump is not quite very into the value stuff. So she talks about critical minerals, energy supply security, helping Vietnam, and shared kind of perception of against Chinese quote unquote coercion. I think that is the reading line. And then, of course, as she went on to Canberra, the language became stronger. This is definitely a hedging. And only 2 or 3 weeks ago, the Vietnamese newly elected party general secretary went to China for a 4-day visit. Vietnam and China has very close strategic collaborations, but Japan would not give up. They wanted to drive the edge to tell the Vietnamese we have this in common. So we need to pay attention to that strategic intention on top of the historical record manipulation here.
In Vietnam, as Professor Jiang mentioned, Takaichi mentioned this free and open Indo-Pacific policy, or in short, FOIP, and she described her political mentors first, proposing this policy 10 years ago, and then she talks about an updated version while she was in Hanoi. Mr. Supta, what exactly does she mean in terms of Japan's foreign policy, and how is that going to impact the region?
I think what she tried to do in Vietnam is build on what her mentor's free and open foreign policy was supposed to be about, which was about freedom, rules-based order, etc., and economic prosperity. But she also sort of tried to adjust it to the circumstances of today. And so she talked particularly, the Americans are not very predictable in their ways these days. And so, and there is this issue of sanctions, counter-sanctions, countermeasures, and unilateralism, both in the political and in the economic realm. So she was talking in terms of, in the context of the Indo-Pacific, how to build in a certain degree of resilience, how to build in a certain degree of strategic autonomy, and also at the same time be able to take advantage of opportunities in the AI arena, and in digital infrastructure, protect digital infrastructure, deepen things like rules-based trading order in terms of the CPTPP. These are mostly, for the most part, unobjectionable. The problem arises out here is that she does not have that inclusive view, because this sort of a universe that she wants to create needs all willing participants to cooperate in that process. And the first willing participant who would want to cooperate in the process would be the Chinese. But you ask the Japanese, and she said it also in her speech, we want to have rules-based economic order by expanding the CPTPP, and then she throws out 3 countries, I think it was Indonesia, Philippines, and United Arab
Not including
Emirates.
China.
And when China is ready to take all those commitments, which each of those countries can, and take it five levels higher. So how come China cannot be? And this has been the part of the problem with the way the Japanese have talked about these issues. When the Chinese are not at the table, they have a lot of nasty darts being thrown against China. But when they face China at the table, they say, oh, we are just trying to build a cooperative strategic partnership with you. How simple, how innocent. And I mean, we're not stupid in this day and age. We know what Japan is saying to whom, and we can figure that out of what its intentions are.
Professor Powell, Japan and Australia, as I mentioned, signed 4 documents on cooperation, including on enhanced defense and security, economic security, critical minerals, and energy security. They also signed contracts in terms of, the $7 billion deal to supply Australia with warships. So how do you look at these deals? What is Japan trying to achieve by, getting closer to Australia in all of that?
Look, clearly the military deal in relation to the frigates is a reflection of Japanese ambitions to expand its so-called defence footprint. It's actually a consequence of an ongoing process of Japanese re-militarisation and expanding its export capabilities, particularly in the arena of lethal weapons, is aimed at enhancing its regional influence. So that's the first thing to note. This is not really a move by Japan in the interests of peace and stability. It's actually in the interests of Japanese remilitarisation ambitions. Now, these ambitions, of course, cut across both Japan's own militaristic cultures that agitate certainly the political right, which is the support base of the current Prime Minister, but it also means that Japan can present to the Americans the face of a loyal servant within the region. None of this ultimately recognises unfolding realities. The unfolding reality is that the American capability in Asia is retreating, certainly in terms of its conventional military capability. The fabric of security within Asia, which very much revolved around the United States in particular, is no longer what it once was. The consequences of America's illegal attacks on Iran and the destruction of American bases throughout the Middle East tells us that America's forward bases are no longer defendable. The Japanese, of course, recognize this as an uncertainty, but their response is irresponsible. The response should actually be to grab this opportunity to contribute to the development of an inclusive Asia security and prosperity architecture that includes everybody. And who else but to include than China, which occupies over 50% of regional GDP. This is why it's irresponsible and why it's selective and ultimately does not serve the interests of Asian nations across the region.
Professor Jiang, we hear the word critical minerals coming up again and again, and of course the security of energy because of the situation in the Strait of Hormuz. How do you look at Japan's offer, to help countries in the region to deal with their energy crisis and to deal with this kind of economic coerciveness that comes from China in terms of critical minerals?
Well, on the specific issue of critical minerals, just like others, such as energy shortages and strategic commodities supply chain, in this range, Japan is definitely following the leadership of the United States. The context here, Professor Powell mentioned, is very clear, and I want to re-emphasize that again. The United States is declining in a certain way that we can see as shown by the war on Iran. Its commitment in Asia is probably retreating, if that's clear at all, in terms of strategic objectives. Japan is failing in that sense. You can see Takaichi's visit to Washington, D.C. And the Western powers, G7, are all coordinating on the critical minerals supply strategy, including Canada actively participating. So we need to put the critical mineral strategy that Japan is pursuing with Vietnam, with Southeast Asian countries, with Australia in that context. The second point I want to make is that I slightly has a different take than Professor Powell about how they contribute. Takaichi's economic agenda at home is clearly trying to use the military rearmament dimensions to stimulate its domestic economy. The Japanese leader now made it very clear that there are many dual-use stimulation purposes if you relax the export of arms, and that can stimulate domestic economy. So we can see the domestic and international connection for her agenda at home and abroad is connected. And the final point I want to say is that the best suitable party to approach this regarding armament sales, transit of arms, sale of frigates and others, including critical minerals, is Australia. Australia is also looking at a retreating United States, uncertain, unpredictable President Trump, and therefore they see Japan coming. They also have worries about China. So you see what's the language that's reflecting in Canberra. The statement is a lot stronger than the statement in Hanoi. And this is the trend that we're seeing. Japan is playing the bridging and fulfilling role in the absence of a clear U.S. direction in the Asia-Pacific region.
Mr. Gupta, I'm going to ask you one question and then Professor Powell, I want to wrap up with you. But Mr. Gupta, the question still relates on the race issue, you know, the racist nature of Japanese identity. You know, it sees itself aligned with the West and not with Asia. Do you think that is going to continue, and what is going to be the implications for the region if that is the case?
I think it will continue because for Japan, ultimately is looking at this through a security lens, from a national defense lens. The only people who are willing to fight with Japan or for Japan in the Asia Pacific are going to be the white countries, which is the United States, Australia, maybe Canada, and the UK. They are not going to have any Asian country, not even the Koreans or anybody, or even the Filipinos fighting on their behalf. The Filipinos might provide territory out there from where missiles are lobbed. And so I think this phenomena of Japan escaping Asia will unfortunately will continue. I mean, this has been 150 years. Even when they have tried to be inclusive with Asia, they have done it in a way where the Asians were always, it was a hierarchical setup with Japan leading. But going forward, I know they want to embrace Asia, they want to bring India in somehow, but ultimately they will depend on the Anglo-Saxon nations.
Okay.
And the dependence is actually expanding at this point of time.
All right.
And I would say, I mean, a simple thing I would tell the Japanese, part of your security dilemma you are creating for yourself is because you all are taking a stand on Taiwan. Taiwan is the wrong place to take a stand. And if you are going to take a stand, you are going to be more dependent on the Anglo-Saxon nations in this regard, which is going to jeopardize your own security.
All right.
So let's get smart about that.
One final question and a devil's advocate, Professor Powell. Some people would say, look, what's wrong with enhanced cooperation? Who would say no to greater freedom, peace and prosperity? Why should people be alerted when Japan talks about enhanced cooperation? Keep it within 1 minute, please.
Well, there are two nations that have been largely the source of regional instability, war and destruction across Asia historically over the course of the last 100 years, and that's Japan and the United States. When Japan talks about freedom, they fail to also talk about what the Americans have been doing across the world, you know, whether it's Cuba, whether it's Iran, or other parts of the world in which the Americans have inflicted pain and suffering on people. This is a selective approach. It is unfortunate because the region deserves a lot better. Countries across the region are looking for peaceful economic development opportunities, not more divide and conquer at the behest of Japan and the Western powers.
All right, we're going to leave it there. Selective is the word. If you're really remorseful and repent for what you did in the past, don't do it in a selective way. Many thanks to Professor Jiang Wenran, founding director of the China Institute at the University of Alberta, Sourabh Gupta, senior Asia-Pacific International Relations Policy Specialist at the Institute for China-America Studies, and Warwick Powell, adjunct professor at Queensland University of Technology. With that, we come to the end of this edition of The Point with me, Liu Xin. As usual, you can follow me on Facebook, X and YouTube using the handle Liu Xin in Beijing. On behalf of the whole team, thank you for watching. You've got the point.